Audiobooks offer a unique way to experience literature, making stories accessible to a wider audience.
Today, we delve into the core objectives of criminology: understanding crime, preventing crime, and ultimately improving justice for all.
So, the broken windows theory suggests that visible signs of crime create an environment that encourages further crime. But what about
2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
The Freedom Charter, a crime against humanity. Since 1994, South Africa was under Freedom Charter. We conclude both apartheid and the Freedom Charter are crimes against humanity. And we will show this to you, and after we have done finished, you will know this truth that has been hidden from you. It is time that you emancipate yourself from mental slavery. And this is the time. The Freedom Charter was not the voice of the people. It was the voice of a small cabal. Dressed up in stolen clothes, the so-called consultations were theater, the demands a prop, the will of the people, a lie scripted before the actors ever took the stage. It was a Trojan horse rolled into South Africa's soul, packed with foreign ideology, and sold as our own heartbeat. This was not democracy. It was the first great political fraud of the liberation era. The Freedom Charter's lie was the seed from which all our modern corruption grew, and the ones who wrote it knew exactly what they were doing. They wrapped a foreign manifesto in our skin, nailed it to a cross called the People, and dared anyone to pull it down. The Freedom Charter was not a liberation manifesto born from the heart of South Africa's people. It was a prescripted ideological blueprint smuggled into the soul of the liberation movement, wrapped in the skin of people's voices. It is this fraud, the calculated hijacking of the nation's will, that qualifies the Freedom Charter as a political crime of the highest order, a crime against humanity itself, if we strip away the romance and propaganda. Presenting the Freedom Charter as the voice of the people, when it was in fact a pre-written, ideologically driven document pushed by a small political core, is at best political fraud, and at worst, a deliberate act of mass deception. It's criminal in the moral sense because it was marketed as grassroots democracy. The story goes that thousands of ordinary South Africans' demands were collected, distilled, and enshrined. The historical evidence doesn't match that story. The text closely mirrored pre-existing communist and socialist manifestos, and many of its provisions were already drafted before any so-called people's consultations took place. It weaponized legitimacy. By claiming to be the will of the people, the Charter became an unchallengeable political shield. To oppose it meant you were against the people themselves, which is a classic manipulation tactic used by revolutionary elites. By fabricating a bottom-up origin story, the ANC secured permanent political legitimacy. The Charter was invoked as an eternal reference point, allowing its ideological DNA to influence policy decades later, even after the original context was gone. In 1955, South Africa had no law that made it a crime to misrepresent the origins of a political program. Political propaganda was fair game. Leaders could claim, "The people wrote this," without facing fraud charges, because the statutes of the day didn't treat political misrepresentation as a prosecutable offense. In the legal sense, it's harder to call it criminal because there wasn't a statute outlawing false political marketing. But if we treat politics as a trust between leaders and the public, then knowingly manufacturing a false origin story for a political blueprint is a betrayal that fits the pattern of political fraud, the kind that lays the foundation for authoritarianism under the banner of democracy. If leaders knowingly misrepresent the origin of a foundational national document, using ordinary people's trust to legitimize an agenda they did not author, is that morally acceptable? The answer, from an ethical standpoint, is clear: no. Such actions betray public trust, distort democratic consent, and manipulate citizens into granting legitimacy they might not have given if they knew the truth. This was not harmless branding. It was the foundational moment when truth was traded for control. The same deceptive DNA that birthed the Charter later enabled cadre deployment, state capture, and suppression of dissent, all in the name of the people. But let us look at this from its origins. What are the events leading to this ideological fraud of the highest order? In the official history of the African National Congress, ANC, the Freedom Charter of 1955 is presented as a shining testament to democracy, a document written by the people and ratified in the spirit of national unity at the Congress of the People in Kliptown in Soweto. But strip away the banners, the slogans, and the rehearsed cheers, and another picture emerges. One of mass deception, ideological infiltration, and the deliberate manufacture of a political myth. The Freedom Charter was not a liberation manifesto born from the heart of South Africa's people. It was a prescripted ideological blueprint smuggled into the soul of the liberation movement, wrapped in the skin of people's voices. It is this fraud, the calculated hijacking of the nation's will, that qualifies the Freedom Charter as a political crime of the highest order, a crime against humanity itself. The ANC's official story is deceptively simple. Thousands of Freedom volunteers collected demands from citizens across the country. These were sorted into themes. A national drafting committee distilled them into clauses. Delegates at Kliptown approved the final text. In reality, the ideological bones of the charter were imported, echoing socialist manifestos from Moscow to Havana. The collection of Freedom demands was theater, controlled, curated, and filtered to produce a predetermined outcome. Voices that did not fit the script were muted. Ideas that matched the political core's vision were magnified. By the time the text reached Kliptown, it was not the people's voice being read aloud. It was the manifesto of a political vanguard, rehearsed for popular approval. Why call this a crime against humanity? Because the Freedom Charter's false origin story was not harmless. It became the moral foundation for decades of political action, from armed struggle to economic policy, under the claim that the people had already spoken in 1955. In the ANC's own telling, the Freedom Charter was the purest moment of people's democracy. They speak of it like a great river gathering its waters from every stream in the land. Farm laborers, factory workers, teachers, students, churchgoers, and community leaders, all sending in their freedom demands from the furthest rural, crawled to the busiest township street. They describe the Freedom volunteers as an army of hope, walking, knocking on doors, holding meetings, collecting the heartbeats of a nation hungry for freedom. They tell us these voices were carried upward, sorted into the great themes of life: land, work, housing, education, justice, and then distilled into the ringing poetry of "The people shall govern, the land shall be shared, the doors of learning and culture shall be opened." They tell us that on those 2 winter days in Kliptown, the People's Parliament assembled under open skies, cheered each clause, and gave their unanimous blessing to the document that would light the road to liberation. And they tell us this is why the Charter is untouchable, because it came from the people themselves. That's the myth. The truth? The Charter did not rise from the soil of the people. It was planted. Its roots were not in the humble notebooks of the Freedom volunteers, but in the pre-written manifestos of a small political core. The consultations were theater. The mass congress was a stage, and the people's voice was a costume worn by an imported ideology. Kliptown was not the birth of the people's will. It was the baptism of a foreign script in the name of South Africa. And that is why the Freedom Charter, far from being our nation's sacred text, stands as one of the greatest political frauds in our history. The first great theft, not of land or money, but of the people's own voice. The Freedom Charter was South Africa's Communist Manifesto. Its structure, its slogans, its economic prescriptions, its moral framing, all follow the Marxist template, whether or not people at Kliptown understood it. The ideological DNA came straight from Karl Marx's playbook. I saw it in the 1980s, when the ANC's external structures and its internal underground began to harden. Christian leaders, bishops, and priests who would not bow to the Charter's authority who kept their first allegiance to the Bible and what the Bible says instead of the party line, found themselves targeted. Some were neglected by the very structures that claimed to speak for them. Some were kidnapped, silenced, disappeared. The liberation movement that claimed to fight for all the people now had its own heresy laws, and those who broke them paid in blood or in exile. The Freedom Charter's so-called People's Voice was no longer just a political text. It was an instrument of control. It gave ideological cover for purges, intimidation, and the crushing of independent moral authority. What had been sold in Cliptown as a document of unity became, in the heat of the 1980s, a weapon to divide and to dominate. By the 1980s, the Freedom Charter was no longer just a political program. It was a test of faith. Oppose it, and you opposed the people. Question it, and you were marked. I saw Christian leaders, bishops, priests, men and women of the cloth, treated as enemies for refusing to put the charter above the gospel. They were neglected, pushed to the margins, their influence cut. I'm off. Some were kidnapped, some disappeared. This was not the South Africa they had fought to free. This was a liberation movement that had learned to purge its own. And I was there. Cliptown was supposed to be the day the people found their voice. Instead, it was the day their voice was stolen and used to beat down anyone who dared to speak with their own.
The Serpent in the Republic, the fall of Christian South Africa to Marxist deception, soul sickness, the hidden plague that has eaten South Africa. Since the year 1994, there is a sickness in South Africa. A sickness deeper than corruption, more devastating than misrule, more poisonous than crime. It is soul sickness, the corrosion of the inner life of a people, the disfiguring of the spiritual and moral foundations of a nation. And while it has worn many disguises, liberation, democracy, freedom, its truest face is deception, betrayal, and decay. Let us speak plainly. What began in 1994 was not a democracy. It was a smokescreen, a distortion of life, a master stroke of illusion and deception. South Africa did not walk into the breeze, but into the whirlwind. It was herded into the dark ages. The term democracy was invoked to usher in what was, in effect, a new era of elite rule, cadre deployment, wholesale looting, and institutional sabotage. And the ruling party, the ANC, made no secret of its priorities. Repeated in Parliament and declared in public, the ANC comes first. South Africa comes second. These were not slips of the tongue. They were policy, they were creed, and they were prophecy. What has followed has been 30 years of devastation economically, culturally, socially, and spiritually. Today, South Africa limps through its streets, her bones hollowed out, her children robbed of wonder, her elders robbed of peace. A raw, festering wound where there was once promise. But how did we get here? To understand the depth of this sickness, we must return to the soul. The true soul of South Africa, the soul that long predated the ANC's communist contamination, was alive with spiritual richness. It breathed through sacred hymns in rural churches. It marched with solemn strength in the feet of Christian African intellectuals and chiefs. It spoke in the tongues of prayer and song, of unity and dignity. When the ANC was founded in 1912, it was born not as a revolutionary Marxist force, but as an African Christian liberation movement. It was conceived in a Methodist church. Its founders were not trained in Moscow or Peking, but in mission schools and theological institutions. They were men of the cloth and conscience. John Dube, Walter Rubusana, Sol Plaatje, Sefako Makatho, Pixley Kassim, Dr. A.B. Zuma, Dr. Moroka, Johannes Mfalela. These were leaders who believed in justice not by bullet, but by principles. Grounded in scripture, community, and service, they did not merely oppose injustice. They offered a vision for justice rooted in African Christian values. When Sefako Makatho took the ANC to the traditional leadership chiefs and kings, Already Christianized through decades of missionary work, there was no contradiction. The union of spiritual, cultural, and political leadership was natural, powerful, and authentic. This is what the ANC once was, a Christian conscience clothed in African identity. But that soul holy, ethical, and rooted was to be bruised. And that bruise, like all dangerous ones, appeared harmless at first like a cancerous lesion. It changed hues slowly, silently reddish-purple to brown. And just as a cancer hides in the flesh before consuming the body, a spiritual cancer was seated inside the ANC around the 1940s. That cancer was Marxist-Leninist communism, a godless materialist ideology that recognized no higher power than the party, no moral law except revolution, no justice but revenge. It was in this moment the betrayal began. It was here that the snake slithered in, not through the door, but through the bloodstream. The ANC's soul, once aflame with Christian hope, began to rot quietly from within. The rise of Nelson Mandela must be placed in this context, not as the father of democracy, but as the midwife of distortion. Mandela did not continue the Christian tradition of John Dube and Safeka Maka, Walter Rabasana, Sol Plaatje. He abandoned it. He replaced it with armed struggle, ideological violence, and a new loyalty to Moscow, not to Christ, to the Communist Manifesto, not to the Beatitudes. Even Mandela admitted, in his own edited-out words, that when he left Evelyn, his devout Christian wife, he entered a path of immorality. But that path was more than personal, it was civilizational. The ANC was never the same again. And soon, neither would South Africa be. 1994 was not the beginning of freedom. It was the completion of the distortion. The ANC that came to power was no longer the ANC of 1912. It had been infected, hijacked, and morphed into a political cartel hiding behind freedom slogans. What emerged was a two-faced monster, one side smiling for global media, the other side plundering the state with surgical precision. What was promised as a new dawn became a long, unbroken night. Under this false democracy, hospitals died, railways rusted, Eskom collapsed. Crime exploded, families disintegrated, hope vanished, but most devastating of all, the soul of South Africa fell sick. Soul sickness is the distortion of life's essence. It is when the spirit of a nation becomes confused, lost, infected. And this soul sickness is not metaphoric. It is everywhere. In the faces of hungry children, in the broken voice of an elder betrayed, in the laughter that has grown sarcastic, bitter, and hollow, in churches now empty or politicized, in the slogans of revolution shouted by millionaires who drink wine while the people eat sorrow. This soul sickness has metastasized. It is now cultural, generational, moral, and unless it is named, uprooted, and cured, South Africa will continue to drift leaderless, anchorless, and numb. Where to from here? We must begin by naming the lie. This is not democracy. It is deceptocracy. Rule of liars who promise liberation while delivering decay. The ANC must not be romanticized. It must be seen in full light. As a movement that began sacred and ended in sabotage, we must restore memory, restore truth, restore soul. And that starts by declaring what most South Africans already whisper, greater than we were betrayed. Our hopes were. Used as bait, our nation was sold to corruption. And the ones who claimed to fight for our freedom ended up stealing it. And so, we write this not as a history, not even as a critique, but as a funeral dirge for a sickened soul. And as a battle cry for resurrection, let this be said for the record of time. The ANC of 1912 was a sacred Christian project. The ANC of 1994 was a communist counterfeit. The South Africa of today is a casualty of soul, betrayal. And unless we return to truth, to God, to values, and to moral leadership, this sickness will only deepen. And the death of the soul is always the death of a nation. Part 2. The lie of necessary communism. how apartheid was already evolving toward justice. The great lie that props up the post-1994 deception is this, that communism was necessary to destroy apartheid. It is the lie shouted from podiums by millionaire revolutionaries. It is the lie printed in school textbooks edited by ideologues. It is the lie whispered in academic corridors by those who have never touched the streets of struggle. But it is a lie, nonetheless. Let us be clear. Apartheid was evil in its conception and unjust in its exclusion, but it was not static. It was not permanent. It was not immune to pressure. It was already evolving, already in retreat, already being reformed from within and dismantled by the very architects who had built it not out of fear, but for moral reckoning, political calculation, and global accountability. To pretend otherwise is not just historically ignorant. It is politically dishonest. Apartheid was dying, not from bullets, but from conscience and reform. By the 1980s, this apartheid government had already begun its terminal descent. Mixed race. Marriages were legalized. Universities were gradually desegregated. Black trade unions were formally recognized. The tricameral parliament was established, a failed step, but a clear sign of change. Talks between the government and ANC had already started in secret. International pressure was mounting, but even more critical, internal Christian moral pressure was breaking the system's spine. And this is what the ANC and its defenders do not want you to remember. It was not communists who softened apartheid's heart. It was not Umkhonto we size random bombs that changed the nation. It was the Christian, conscience white, and black that steadily exposed the sin of apartheid in pulpits, universities, and boardrooms. It was the ordinary South Afrikaners, included, who began to ask themselves, is this who we are? Is this how we want to be remembered? The truth is that many of apartheid's own leaders were already building the bridge out. P.W. Botha, for all his stubbornness, initiated reforms. F.W. de Klerk took the ultimate step. This is not to praise apartheid men. It is to recognize historical reality. Apartheid was being unwound by its own engineers. That is not something a communist will ever admit. Why? Because it destroys their central myth that they were the saviors, that blood was the only answer, that only Marx and Mao could kill the beast, but they were not saviors. They were opportunists. They saw a dying system and ran toward it not to save the people, but to hijack the moment. And once the reins of power were handed over, they did not build a new nation. They plundered it. They divided it. They infected it with the disease of racial revenge, cadre deployment, and institutional theft. They inherited a country on the verge of reconciliation and instead declared war on its soul. The ANC did not liberate South Africa. It captured it. Let this be said loud and clear. South Africa was not liberated by bombs in shopping malls. South Africa was not saved by Soviet manifestos. South Africa was not healed by angry chants and necklace in flames. It is one of the greatest lies of the modern age that Nelson Mandela was in prison for fighting for freedom. This myth, repeated in media and textbooks, conveniently deletes the most important fact. Mandela was a member of the South African Communist Party, SACP, and at the time of his arrest, he was not just a member. He was on its central committee. The ANC was founded in 1912, and no one was arrested until Nelson Mandela and his mob hijacked the ANC in the mid-1940s. So, we know that the white government understood the ANC and worked with it. Yes, they understood the pledges of the ANC, they accepted and opened the union buildings for dialogues with men like Sefako Makatho, John Dubé, Walter Rabazana, and Sol Plaatje. Even the British Empire opened its palaces in London to welcome the ANC leaders. The men who founded the ANC in 1912 were men of peace and vision, not violence. Violence in the ANC was brought in by Nelson Mandela and his comrades. We will look at that deep and hard, consider this very fact. In 2013, long after Mandela's global beatification, the South African Communist Party finally confirmed what had long been whispered. Mandela was a member of the Central Committee of the SACP at the time of his arrest in 1962. For decades, this was flatly denied. The goal was simple: to preserve Mandela's myth as a liberal reformer rather than a Marxist revolutionary. But the evidence had always been there. The ANC, under Mandela's leadership, entered into an unholy alliance with the SACP, an organization wholly committed to Soviet-style intervention. This wasn't abstract. Mandela co-founded Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, the joint military wing of the ANC and SACP. MK's explicit aim was to launch sabotage campaigns and usher in armed revolution. Mandela even traveled to Algeria for military training, drawing lessons from revolutionary warfare and aligning himself with blood-soaked insurgents of the global left. He was not merely a political leader. He was a commander, a strategist, a covert operator in a broader Marxist war. To understand why Mandela was arrested, we must remember the global context. The 1960s was the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. The United States, United Kingdom, France, and West Germany were investing their full political and financial might to prevent the spread of communism. The Soviet Union and China, meanwhile, were exporting revolution, not by diplomacy, but by bullets, bombs, and proxy wars. Everywhere communism landed, it brought death. Stalin's USSR murdered over 20 million. Mao's China oversaw the deaths of over 45 million in the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution. Cambodia's Khmer Rouge exterminated 1/3 of its population. Communism was not about justice or freedom. It was about erasing God, family, private property, and dissent. It was about state terror in the name of utopia. South Africa, with its advanced economy and strategic location, became a target. Communists wanted to take over South Africa through violence and the barrel of the gun. Mandela and his comrades were the domestic vehicle for this vision. That's why he was arrested. Not because he fought apartheid, but because he was part of a global ideological war to destroy the West from within. What was Mandela actually doing? When Mandela was captured in 1962, he was traveling in disguise, using false name David Motsamai. He had been moving between countries, training in military tactics, and liaising with communist networks. South African intelligence intercepted documents, testimonies, and operational plans tying him directly to MK's sabotage operations. His arrest was not arbitrary. It was intelligence-led. He was not a poet holding a placard. He was the head of a war military force engaged in high-level strategic planning to cripple South Africa's infrastructure. In the infamous Rivonia trial, Mandela and others were not charged for beliefs. They were charged for conspiracy to overthrow the government using violence, guns, and bombs. Evidence presented included 210,000 hand grenades and 48,000 anti-tank mines in planning stages. A manual titled How to Be a Good Communist in Mandela's handwriting. When you read that manual, How to Be a Good Communist simply meant how to kill. Yes, detailed sabotage blueprints and plans for guerrilla warfare. These are not the acts of a peaceful protester. The manufactured saint and the death of accountability. After 27 years in prison, Mandela emerged to a world that had reshaped the narrative. Western guilt, media manipulation, and communists. Cunning merged to rebrand him as a secular messiah. The Communist Party, once working underground, walked openly into government alongside the ANC. South Africa was handed not to freedom, but to a Marxist-influenced alliance that looted the country blind. Cadre deployment replaced merit, land. Expropriation without compensation looms large. Corruption, crime, and collapse became the norm. This is not Mandela's betrayal. It is his legacy. He didn't hijack the ANC. He redirected it from its Christian humanist roots into a tool, the Global Communist Network. He buried John Dubé, Sefeko Makatho, and Sol Plaatje under a mountain of Marxist ideology and atheist revolution. What began as a call for equality ended in lies, secrets, assassinations, political betrayal, and a near-total collapse of state institutions. And at the center of that vortex was a man who smiled in front of the cameras, while he bowed in secret to Joseph Stalin, Lenin, Marx, and Mao. Restore history to truth. The time has come to strip away the myth, to teach our children not just of injustice, but of infiltration, to understand that not every freedom fighter fights for freedom. Nelson Mandela was not jailed for his skin. He was jailed for his allegiance to a bloody revolution, to an anti-God ideology, to a global network that had already destroyed nations and now set its sights on South Africa. And they succeeded. Until we tell this truth, South Africa will remain trapped in the fantasy of liberation while rotting under the real consequences of deception. Here is a personal story of violence that directly links Nelson Mandela. You cannot deny this. This is a personal experience. This will tell who Nelson Mandela is. This story happened in 1986. I was 15 when I saw her burn. They called her Gogo, an old woman bent with years and soft-spoken, the kind who greeted you with a smile even. When her world was crumbling, that day she wasn't smiling. She was screaming. It was after her funeral. A comrade had died young, militant, angry, and the crowd was boiling with vengeance. The whispers started long before the fire. Her son is an Impimpi, a traitor, a suspected police informant. And in those days, suspicion was enough to sign your death warrant. They didn't find the son. They found her instead. She was pulled from her hut like a rag doll, dragged across the gravel road. A tire was forced over her frail chest and shoulders, wedging her arms down like a sacrificial offering. Then came the petrol. Then came the match. The flames took her slowly, as if savoring the moment. I watched as fire licked her flesh, as her body twisted in unnatural agony. She screamed for her son, for God, for mercy, but none came. Only cheers, songs, raised fists. Revolution, they said. But I knew it was murder, and I have carried the smell of that burning flesh in my nostrils for 40 years. Let me not waste your time. Let me not bury truth beneath politeness or slow revelation. I will not build up to the point. I will say it now this second. This is the Nelson Mandela you do not know. Not the myth, not the monument, not the smiling statue outside the courthouse. The man, the real man, Nelson Mandela, the murderer who dressed in clothes of peace, and the man who destroyed South Africa. This is not speculation. This is not political poetry. This is truth grounded in blood, truth passed through fire, truth buried for decades beneath the propaganda machine that turned a militant revolutionary into a global saint. You see, that necklacing I witnessed at 15 wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't the chaos of a grieving crowd. It was an execution carried out by foot soldiers of the movement. And behind that movement, guiding its rage, was a system of coded letters sent from prison by Nelson. Mandela, yes, from prison. They don't tell you this, do they? They tell you he was silenced, powerless, a peaceful giant locked away from the world. But the truth is, Mandela was never voiceless. He wrote constantly letters, messages, instructions. Some smuggled in, some smuggled out, some written in code. Some read only by the initiated. The ANC of Mandela was not the ANC of 1912. It had been hijacked, twisted from a Christian liberation movement into a revolutionary machine fed by Marxist ideology and lubricated by blood. And Mandela, charming, articulate, and camera-friendly, was its untouchable spiritual commander. The orders were clear. Intensify the struggle. Punish traitors. Send a message. That message arrived at my doorstep in the form of a burning grandmother. This book is not written in hatred. It is written in grief. Grief for a nation that was seduced. Grief for the children raised on lies. Grief for the dead whose names are not inscribed on marble walls, but who scream from unmarked graves and scorched townships. If you came here expecting another hymn to Mandela, close this book now. If you came here to defend your illusions, you will not last long. But if you came for truth raw, unsanitized, and hard as stone, then read on. Because the greatest deception ever sold to the world is that Nelson Mandela was a man of peace. He was not. He was a man of coded orders, targeted killings, and orchestrated fear. He was a man of smiles for the camera and fire behind the curtain. The republic he was hailed for saving, he quietly sabotaged.
Chapter 1. Once upon a time, Nelson Mandela had a marriage that looked like it was made in heaven. Evelyn Mays was not only his wife, but his moral anchor. A devout African Christian woman who built a stable home while her husband walked in the hallowed footsteps of giants like Sefako Mikado, Walter Rubusana, Sol Plaatje, John Dube, Dr. Moroka. These men, pioneers of the early African National Congress, were Christian intellectuals, steeped in the African church tradition, and tethered to a worldview where theology and reason, like in the thought of Thomas Aquinas, were inseparable. That was the milieu. That was the ANC Mandela first found himself in. But somewhere along the road, Mandela veered off that path. He embraced communism, aligning himself not with African spirituality and Christian reasoning, but with Marxist dogma. That shift wasn't just ideological. It tore apart his household. Evelyn, true to her faith and culture, fought to bring her husband back, spiritually and emotionally. She resisted the change. But Mandela, consumed by a new revolution, asked for divorce, and in his own words, words that were edited out in later publications of Long Walk to Freedom, he confessed the truth. He admitted that after leaving Evelyn, he went down a path of immorality. That wasn't the language of liberation. That was the cry of conscience. He knew what he was doing. This wasn't about freedom, it was about forsaking something sacred. Then came Winnie Mandela, late teen, young, beautiful, fiery. The cameras loved it. So did the movement. The images remain: parades, rallies, headlines. But what lies beneath? Glamour is loud, but it doesn't say much. What we do know is that Winnie Mandela later became a lightning rod for both adoration and infamy. And accusations of murder and sleeping with young men in front of Nelson Mandela. We know very little, except that it happened on the stage, not the altar. That path of immorality Mandela referred to was not just about women. It symbolized the wholesale abandonment of a deeply rooted tradition. The ANC of John Dube Makatho Rubusana was Christian, rational, nation-building. Mandela's new ANC, especially after 1960, was militant, Marxist, and rooted in revolutionary dogma. He did not just change partners, he changed purpose. The theology of the ANC was replaced with the ideology of Lenin. Fast forward decades later, to his twilight years with Graca Machel. Here was a different Mandela, aged, powerful, but introspective. Graca tells of how he would sometimes sit for hours, motionless, silent, not asleep, not resting. Just gone somewhere far. Deep in his mind, haunted. Haunted not by enemies, but by history, by decisions made, roads taken, values forsaken. That silence wasn't peace. It was torment. It was the silence of a man who had walked away from Evelyn, from African Christian values, from the cause of moral liberation into a new gospel of power, revolution, and compromise. Perhaps Mandela, in those long silences, saw the ghosts of his old comrades, the early saints of the ANC, watching, asking, "Why did you leave our path?" He had won the world's praise, but did he lose his soul? His marriage to Graca Machel may have brought global celebration, but behind the applause, there sat a man, still withdrawn, staring into space. Not the face of freedom. The face of a man revisiting the crossroads of his life. Mandela was a man who, in his final days, was forced to stare down the truth that history is not kind to those who betray their roots. No matter how many statues are built, a man may win the world and yet be visited daily by the silence of a betrayed conscience. The fall of Dr. James Moroka. The fall of Moroka and the rise of fire, 1952. At the height of the Defiance Campaign, Mandela accused Dr. James Moroka, then president of the ANC, of cowardice and weakness. Dr. James Moroka, a Christian doctor and a man of deep humility, had pleaded for moderation. He had warned of chaos. For that, he was humiliated, pushed a chair, and fell down in shame. His dignity meant nothing in the new ANC that was being born. The Congress was no longer a gathering of elders and educators. It was becoming a battleground. Mandela, with his comrades in the ANC Youth League, redirected the river, and it has flowed that way ever since today. The marks remain. The ANC, once rooted in Christian values, African customs, and constitutional reasoning, was infiltrated by communist ideology, foreign slogans, clenched fists, and militant posturing. Even today, the party's internal contradictions echo from that pivot. Mandela broke the line of the founding grandfathers. He abandoned their method, their patience, their belief in persuasion over revolution. History demands we speak both grace and grit. This is not an attack. It is a reckoning. Mandela was not a continuation of Makoth, Upwatia, or Rabasana. He was a rupture, and history must be brave enough to hold both truths, that a legend rose, and in doing so, silenced a lineage of dialogue that was already building something real. We must learn from that, not in bitterness, but in balance. Whose son was Nelson Mandela, really? He was born in the Eastern Cape, not far from the moral thunder of T.O. Soga, the great African theologian and first ordained Black Presbyterian minister. A man of soul, scholarship, and sacrifice. That region breathed dignity, mission schools, Christian values, and ancestral depth. Mandela walked those same hills. He was influenced by Sefako Mikado, a disciplined Methodist and the second president of the ANC, a man who believed leadership was service, not spectacle. He was married to Evelyn Mays, a devoted Christian and nurse, a woman of quiet strength. But in time, he abandoned her both emotionally and politically, accusing her of being too religious, too Christian, and in that moment, a turn began. From the moral clarity of the missionaries, from the African Christian lineage of John Dube, Walter Rubusana, and Sefako Makwetho, Mandela turned toward Marx, Dr. James Moroka, a president who defended Mandela during the treason trials, tried to pull the ANC back from the cliff. He saw what was happening, the hijacking of the ANC by external ideologies, foreign to African soil. He called for reason, reform, and restraint. But Mandela and his faction saw him as a relic, a man of the past. They led a campaign to expel him, calling him a sellout and coward. His crime? Advocating for moderation and peace, the very values Mandela would later claim to champion. This wasn't just a power struggle. It was a coup against the conscience of the movement. We must ask, why? Why did a man raised in African traditionally houses and African values, with the influence of Christian tradition, turn his back on that foundation to embrace an ideology that came from European atheists with no understanding of African life? Was this strategy, or was it surrender? The communists in South Africa at the time were white intellectuals, mostly Jewish émigrés, academics, and doctrinaire Marxists. They saw the ANC as useful, and Mandela, burning with youthful ambition and thirst for influence, let himself be drawn in. He aligned with Moses Kotane, Joe Slovo, Ruth First, Hilda Bernstein, and the rest of the South African Communist Party. And in doing so, he left behind something sacred, the black leadership tradition rooted in the church, in the village, in the language of elders, in the quiet dignity of our ancestors. He would later walk confidently into courtrooms with a clenched fist, quoting Marx and Lenin, not Walter Rabasana and John Dube. He would wear the military fatigues of Umkhonto we Sizwe, founded under communist influence. Rather than the scholar's robe of African tradition, he would be celebrated abroad not by Black African thinkers, but by European radicals. So what are we to make of this? Was it bold strategy, or was it inferiority complex dressed up as revolution? Mandela was brilliant. But brilliance can bend. And perhaps, in those decades of fire and fury, he bent too far. He walked away from the clarity of his fathers and into the fog of borrowed ideologies. He exchanged the trodden path of Sefako Makado, Walter Rabasana, for the slippery stage of Marx. He sought revolution, but may have lost rootness. And today, we still live under that shift. The ANC never returned to its moral spine. It became addicted to the language of struggle, not the language of wisdom. It copied the forms of communism without its discipline and forgot the heart of its own African ethic. Mandela is not to be hated. He is to be understood fully. Whose son was Nelson Mandela? Really? Let us revisit that. He was born in the Eastern Cape, under the influence of Tio Soga's Ghostaland, where mission schools taught not just literacy, but character. He was shaped by the discipline of African Christianity, by the sober dignity of Methodist order, and the firm but gentle hands of Black leadership men like Sefako Makwutho, a Methodist minister, a politician, a moral man. Mandela once said that he was spellbound by the example of Sefako Makwutho. So much so that when his first son was born, he named him Makwutho Mandela, tribute to a man whose quiet wisdom had left a mark on his soul. Then he turned and, yet despite this foundation, Mandela turned. He married Evelyn Mays, a nurse and Madas, and Christian woman grounded in faith and family. But that marriage did not last. Mandela accused her of being too religious, too conservative, too unwilling to match his political fire. The real reason was deeper. He had already begun moving away, not just from her, but from the values they once shared. In his own words, his own mouth, Mandela later confessed, "After I left Evelyn, I followed a path of a moral life." He said it clearly, but when the manuscript of Long Walk to Freedom was edited and prepared for global publication, those words were removed, censored. Chapter 3. Robben Island, the Communist Classroom. History often paints Robben Island as a monastery of suffering, a lonely island where Mandela emerged as a peaceful sage. But behind the bars, a very different Mandela was at work, not meditating, in silence, but lecturing like a revolutionary professor. Crafting a blueprint for a Marxist South Africa, Robben Island was not only a prison, it was a school of ideology, a war room behind bars, a place where Mandela, like Hitler writing Mein Kampf, developed and taught the mental machinery of permanent revolution. 1. Robben Island was his classroom. Mandela did not waste time in his cell. He organized study groups among political prisoners. He taught courses in Marxist theory, class struggle, and dialectical materialism. He developed a political curriculum that framed South Africa's future as one of liberation through state control, not individual freedom. He wasn't just resisting oppression, he was programming minds, and the operating system he installed was communism with African skin. 2. His idol was not Walter Rabasana, but Fidel Castro. Mandela admired Fidel Castro, Ho Chi Minh, Che Guevara, and Mao Zedong. Not once did he publicly praise democratic models of liberty, like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, or Mahatma Gandhi's spiritual nonviolence. To Mandela, the path forward was not about building free citizens, but about building liberation armies and centralized state control. He saw the state as the weapon, the party as the vehicle, the enemy as permanent. And at Robben Island, he indoctrinated hundreds of inmates, men who would later fill the corridors of power. After 1994, with that very ideology, 3. The birth of the modern ANC bureaucrat. What? The birth of the modern ANC bureaucrat. What do you see today in the ANC? Arrogant, lazy politicians who believe they are owed power. Corrupt officials who see state jobs as struggle compensation. Ministers who quote slogans instead of implementing policy. This behavior didn't emerge from nowhere. It was cultivated in prison. They were taught that the struggle justifies all, that the state belongs to the revolutionaries, not the people. Mandela's Robben Island cadres did not come out to serve. They came out to rule with a doctrine, not a constitution. 4. The myth of the humble prisoner. The popular image is of Mandela as a humble, softened man after years of suffering. But in truth, Robben Island hardened his ideological resolve, entrenched his view of enemy logic, turned the ANC into a political religion, where questioning the leader is blasphemy. While the world saw a statesman in the making, a party general was being forged, surrounded by men who would one day control the police, the treasury, the intelligence services. Mandela wasn't just a prisoner. He was the professor of the revolution. Robben Island was his lecture hall. And South Africa today lives with the consequences of what was taught behind those walls. 5. From chain. Gang 2 chairmanship mean the same way Hitler used Mein Kampf to seed the Nazi Party's rise. Mandela used prison as an incubator of ideology. The seeds he planted grew into cadre deployment, tone party, arrogant state, centralization, bureaucratic corruption, permanent racial grievance. He never renounced these foundations. He only coded them in reconciliation language after their roots had already grown deep. Mandela walked out of prison holding a flower in his hand. But the soil beneath that flower was red with the ink of Marx and the ashes of a moral ANC. Final word. Robben Island did not purify Mandela. It sharpened him, focused him, and gave him disciples. He entered as a rebel. He left as a revolutionary messiah, ready to redeem South Africa, not through freedom, but through ideological conquest. And so we must repeat for emphasis. When people speak of Robben Island, they picture a place of sorrow, a lonely, wind-swept prison that broke men down, a place where Nelson Mandela, stripped of everything, somehow rose above hate and emerged purified. But that's the story they want you to believe. The deeper truth is more complex and more dangerous. Robben Island was not just a prison. It was a school of ideology, and Mandela was not just a prisoner. He was a teacher, a man indoctrinating others with the radical political ideas that would later define post-apartheid South Africa. To understand the damage that began on that island, we must first understand a name that strikes terror into the 20th century. Adolf Hitler and his book, Mein Kampf. 1. What was Mein Kampf, and why does it matter? Mein Kampf, meaning my struggle, is the book Hitler wrote while imprisoned in 1924. During that time, he reflected on his defeat, blamed enemies, laid out a long-term political vision, and converted his fellow prisoners into ideological disciples. It was in that prison, not on the battlefield, that Hitler planted the seeds of Nazi ideology. He reframed his personal suffering into a collective mission. And he used his prison sentence to reshape the minds of those around him. When he left, he didn't leave as a broken man. He left with a vision, a doctrine, and a following. That is the chilling parallel to Robben Island, a South African Mein Kampf, like Hitler. Mandela entered prison not as a nobody, but already as a prominent activist. He was not a grassroots struggler with no political compass. He was a high-ranking, communist-trained revolutionary, closely linked to Moses Kotane, the South African Communist Party, and Soviet-aligned liberation movements. While the world imagined Mandela silently breaking rocks, the real work was taking place inside the prison walls. Political education, classes, study groups on Marxism, Leninism, Maoist moral law, Discussions on what South Africa will look like after we win. Mandela became a professor of ideology. His prison lectures were not philosophical reflections on peace. They were political training grounds, laying the foundation for one-party dominant state. Power as a revolutionary tool, framing the ANC as permanent liberators, never as servancy, taught men that freedom was not the end goal. Power was, and revolution must never end, even after the enemy is gone. The men Mandela trained in prison are the same men who now run corrupt State Departments worship the ANC as if it is a divine movement treat. Criticism as betrayal, believe that public office is a reward, not a duty. This is no accident. They were taught that the ANC is the only legitimate custodian of the nation, a political, broad church, whose priests were born in prison and raised in struggle. From the very beginning, they saw South Africa not as a democracy, but as a liberated zone now owned by the victors of war. It is true that Mandela spoke of peace and unity after prison, but by then, the ideological infrastructure was already in place. A worldview of perpetual struggle, a culture of blaming external enemies, psychology of victimhood as power, and a loyalty to the party above the people. He could not undo what he had spent decades teaching, just as Hitler's Mein Kampf could not be erased by later apologies. Mandela's Robben Island curriculum cannot be erased by handshakes and rugby jerseys. The ANC became what it was taught to become. Final word. Robben Island was not a monastery. It was a military academy of ideology. Mandela was not only a prisoner. He was a professor, a party general, and an ideological engineer. And today, South Africa is the product of what he taught. Before we build a new nation, we must first ask, what exactly did Mandela plant in the minds of those prisoners? Because the fruit of that tree is what we are all forced to eat today. Robben Island did not purify Mandela. It sharpened him, focused him, and gave him disciples. He entered as a rebel. He left as a revolutionary messiah, ready to redeem South Africa. Not through freedom, but through ideological conquest. In the same way Hitler used Mein Kampf to seed the Nazi Party's rise, Mandela used prison as an incubator of ideology. The seeds he planted grew into cadre deployment tone, party arrogant state. Centralization, bureaucratic corruption, permanent racial grievance. He never renounced these foundations. He only coded them in reconciliation language after their roots had already grown deep. Mandela walked out of prison holding a flower in his hand. But the soil beneath that flower was red with the ink of Marx and the ashes of a moral ANC. You cannot build unity on top of a lie. Mandela's revolution gave birth to an ANC that no longer respects the people, the law, or the dream of shared citizenship. And until we admit that he poisoned the spring, we will keep drinking from this bitter, polluted stream, wondering why the water still tastes like war. It is time to speak with unflinching honesty. The old ANC was buried under Mandela's Revolution South. Africa's moral fabric was shredded when the ANC embraced communist antagonism. Mandela's late-stage forgiveness was noble, but too late, and too shallow if we want to rebuild South Africa. We must start by telling the truth about how it was broken. Mandela cannot be both the man who brought communism into the ANC and the saint who preached peace and forgiveness after the damage was done. He lit the match, then cried reconciliation. While watching the house burn, he replaced a party of spiritual resistance with a party of ideological conquest. And now, that party is eating the country alive while still chanting slogans from 1960. Chapter 4. Letters of Fire. How Mandela's prison writings lit the match. The world was told that Nelson Mandela sat quietly in Robben Island, longing for peace, forgiveness, and unity. Nelson Mandela wrote letters and issued them out. This is another truth, one that smuggled its way out of prison, inked in calculated fury, shaped by Leninist doctrine and designed to keep the war alive even while he was behind bars. These were not just letters. These were tactical communiques, and they did not preach peace. They instructed revolution. They inspired death by burning tires. They set minds on fire long before. South Africa's towns burned. 1. The smuggled letters. Weapons of psychological warfare. Mandela's letters from Robben Island were never just personal. They were encoded messages, often smuggled out by trusted comrades and relayed to ANC networks in Lusaka, Mozambique, and across townships. They were full of coded instructions, reinforcement, enemy identification, frameworks, and psychological motivation to continue the armed struggle. He presented himself as a distant commander, issuing strategic directives to those on the ground to maintain resistance. So unrest and not rest until the revolution consumed the old order. These were not love letters to South Africa. They were revolutionary blueprints. 2. The doctrine behind the pen. Lenin's shadow. Mandela was trained in the doctrine of Leninism. The Lenin School, based in Moscow, trained thousands of African communists and revolutionaries. Its teachings were simple but devastatingly effective. Sabotage is legitimate. Infiltration is strategy. Camouflage is survival. Every institution must be captured and turned. The enemy must not be debated. He must be discredited, destabilized, or destroyed. Mandela's letters carried these principles like viral code, infecting the resistance with a relentless doctrine of destruction. It wasn't just about defeating apartheid. It was about replacing it with total ideological control. 3. The enemy within. Turning neighbor against neighbor. These letters introduced and reinforced the doctrine of the internal enemy. That is, anyone who cooperated with the state refused to join armed struggle, believed in peaceful reform, criticized ANC violence, was labeled a collaborator, sellout, or enemy of the people. And the punishment: necklacing tires soaked in petrol placed around the neck and set on fire. Hundreds, if not thousands, of black South Africans were burned alive in the name of liberation, not by apartheid police, but by township revolutionaries. Radicalized by the ideology seeded in those letters, the so-called People's War was not a spontaneous uprising. It was engineered psychological warfare fed by underground communications from the island. 4. The myth of the innocent messenger. Even today, people speak of Mandela's letters from prison as if they were moral reflections, like Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. They were nothing of the sort. Mandela's letters named targets, drew enemy lines, oozed Leninist language of struggle, class war, and infiltration, never condemned violent punishment of black moderates. He never once called for an end to necklacing. He never wept publicly for burned children, accused of being spies. He never rebuked the ANC's internal purges and bloody discipline methods, because it was all part of the plan. 5. From the island. The fire spread, the letters became sermons. The sermons became slogans. The slogans became flames. From Uitenhage to Soweto. From KwaMashu to Langa. A new culture emerged. One of vigilante justice, one of righteous violence, one of dehumanizing the enemy. Even if he looked like your neighbor, the revolution was no longer about land or votes. It was about power through fear. And Mandela, the man in prison, had become the voice from the shadows, feeding the fire without lifting a gun. Final word: the ink from Robben Island didn't write peace. It wrote war. While the world worshipped Mandela as a saint waiting, he was scripting a doctrine of control, purge, and permanent revolution, one that burned not only buildings, but souls. Until we understand the true nature of those letters, we will never understand how the ANC came to believe it owns South Africa, not by election, but by conquest. When the world cheered in 1990 as Nelson Mandela walked free, they believed a statesman had come to lead South Africa into peace, unity, and progress. But what actually emerged from Victor Verster prison was not a leader ready to govern, but the symbolic general of an ideological army, an army trained in sabotage, not statecraft. The ANC was not prepared to govern. It was prepared to seize the state, not build it. It came out of the bush and prison with a doctrine of domination, not a blueprint for a functioning society. This chapter tells how a revolutionary machine, forged in secrecy and struggle, marched into government buildings and parliament without shedding its war clothes. And how this is the root of South Africa's destruction. 1. From the trenches to the treasury. The illusion of readiness. The ANC told the world it was ready to govern. But governing requires institutional knowledge, policy planning, public administration skills, national economic understanding, civil service ethics, a service delivery mindset. The ANC had none of these. It had slogans, guerrilla tactics, loyalty, networks, enemy mindsets. It had been forged in exile, in bunkers, in bush camps, in jail cells. And it was mentally locked in the framework of war, where the aim is to crush opposition, not build coalitions to cadre deployment, infiltration, not merit instead of appointing competent professionals. The ANC unleashed the Leninist strategy of cadre deployment. Loyal foot soldiers were placed in every department. Public service became a political weapon state. Organs were no longer neutral. They became extensions of the party. This was not transformation. It was occupation. Every hospital, municipality, court, school, and SOE became a cell in the ANC's control grid. Merit was discarded. Loyalty was supreme. Corruption was inevitable. You don't build a country with foot soldiers. You build it with engineers, educators, planners, and patriots. But none of them were trusted because they weren't comrades. 3. Enemies everywhere. The war mindset continues even in power. The ANC could not abandon the language of struggle. The press became counter-revolutionaries. Business became white monopoly capital. Opposition became racists or colonial agents. Whistleblowers became sellouts instead of fostering peace. The ANC invented new enemies to keep the revolutionary fire alive. That's why it's been 30 years, and we still hear the same chants. Down with apartheid. Forward to the revolution. The struggle continues. They are in office, yet still pretend they are in exile, because psychologically, they never left the bush. For power, not progress. The ANC never came into government with the goal of excellence. It came with one goal: hold power forever. This meant no decentralization, no independent judiciary, no clean audits, no space for merit-based rise. Instead, it gave birth to state capture, tender cartels, ghost workers, political assassinations, factional warfare. All these are natural outcomes of a ruling party that still sees itself as a liberation army, not a government. 5. The destruction was by design. This wasn't just incompetence. It was the inevitable fruit of a movement that was trained to destroy, rewarded struggle, loyalty over skill, trusted ideology over evidence, confused revolution with governance. Mandela never dismantled the ideological machine. He allowed it to enter the union buildings intact. He did not reform it, he legitimized it. And so the ANC, with fists in the air and fire in its slogans, walked into Parliament as if it were a battlefield and saw every part of the state as spoils of war. Final word. They marched from Robben Island to the Union buildings, not as public servants, but as victors of a long war. They didn't come to heal. They came to conquer. They didn't come to fix the country. They came to possess it. And now the nation bleeds from every artery, not because it was never free, but because it was handed over to a political army with no peace plan. A strange thing happened after EMC took over. The African National Congress did not become a political party in the normal sense. It did not settle into democracy. It did not submit itself to accountability or healthy criticism. Instead, it transformed into something far more dangerous and far more difficult to dislodge. It became a religion. Not a religion of God, not a religion of love or liberation, but a political cult, where the party became God and loyalty replaced logic. In this religion, the greatest sin is dissent. The holiest act is obedience to the high priest of the party, and the people themselves, black, poor, unemployed, broken, have become the burnt offerings. 1. The party is always right. In a healthy democracy, parties come and go, policies succeed or fail. Citizens evaluate and vote accordingly, but not in the ANC's theology. In the ANC religion, the party cannot be wrong. If something fails, it's because of sabotage or enemies. If the country suffers, it's not the party's fault. It's apartheid, or imperialism, or racism. This is the logic of the cult. The leader is never guilty. The party is never to blame. Dissenters are always devils. Truth is no longer measured by facts, only by alignment with the sacred narrative. 2. Cadres as priests. Revolutionaries as saints in this religion. Mandela is canonized as the saint of sacrifice. Chris Honey is the martyr of the revolution. ANC veterans are spiritual elders. Struggle credentials are more important than results. Young person with a brilliant idea is ignored. An old cadre with no plan but a resume from 1984 is worshipped. Competence is irrelevant. Struggle history is scripture.